Paul McCartney, the longtime music legend, has been known for writing a huge number of hit songs for the Beatles and writing classic bass lines to go along with them. So it's a bit surprising to find out that he never wanted to be a bassist in the first place. He joined the Beatles as a guitarist. How could someone write such great bass lines without being a bass player? Well, his bass lines weren't always that great. Sorry. So in this video, we'll break down his bass lines into 3 levels, tracking his progress from reluctant noob to proud pro, and we'll even address a common misconception about his writing process. Could it be that the guitar actually has a greater impact on his writing than we think it does? The bass player was normally a fat guy who stood at the back. None of us wanted that. We wanted to be up front, singing, looking good. There's no other reason, basically. So this not only shows us his initial attitude towards bass playing, but you can also imagine what a bass player like this would sound like. And it sounds like Love Me Do. And this is level 1, root and fifth bass lines with very simple rhythms. And it's kinda boring. Of course it suits the song perfectly well, but if all his bass lines sounded like this, we probably wouldn't be talking about them all these years later. In some songs, he at least changes the rhythm for some sectional contrast, like he does in Please Please Me. As generic as a bass line like this might be, it's not really Paul's fault, because before the Beatles, most pop music was made like this. Guy at publishing company sends song to producer friend to record. Producer writes formulaic arrangement of song, hires anonymous session musicians, and finds a charismatic young singer to record the song. Song gets released, teenagers go nuts for singer, but after a year or two, or even maybe just a single or two, nobody cares about this singer anymore. So, publishing guy and producer guy rinse and repeat with a new song and a new singer. So we can't really hold it against Paul for bass lines like this, because most of the music he would have been listening to would have been made in a cookie-cutter approach kind of like this. So his music and his bass lines are very much a product of their time. But the Beatles were breaking the rules from day one, and they insisted on writing their own songs, performing all the instruments, and singing all the parts on their own recordings. But still, it would take a few albums and a few years for classic bass lines to emerge, and for Paul to reach level 2. Once I realized that you didn't have to just play the root notes. If it was CFG chords, then it was normally CFG that I played. But I started to realize that you could be staying on the C when it went to F. You might even be able to play notes that aren't in the chord. McCartney is referencing a couple of techniques here, both of which appear in the B section of Michelle. See if you can guess what they are. If you guessed inversions and passing tones, you're correct. In level 2, he now uses all the basic chord tones, root, third, fifth, and seventh, which sometimes result in inversions, which is when a note other than the root is played in the bass, although actual inversions are kind of rare in Beatles songs, we'll see why in a second. And he connects these basic chord tones with non-chord tones from the scale, which are passing tones. Passing tones are a lot more common in Beatles songs, so let's start there. A simple guide to passing tones. Imagine you're a bass player and you're playing John Lennon's new song. He tells you,
"It's just a C chord the whole time."
You say,
"Okay, no problem."
And you play just a C note the whole time. John says,
"It's kind of boring."
You say,
"Aye, okay then."
And play all the chord tones, C, E, G. John says,
"Aye, that may be good enough for the bottles, but with the Beatles, so gimme more notes."
You think,
"Aye, why don't you play bass then?"
But you're too polite, so you figure out that it actually sounds great to connect the basic chord tones with in-between notes from the scale. These are passing tones. And in Michelle, we have basic chord tones on the strong beats, mostly, and passing tones on the weak beats, mostly. You're also smart, so you say,
"Hey, aren't all of these inversions?"
And I say, no. Context is everything. First of all, if they were inversions, the chord progression would look like this. Do you want that? I don't think so. Second of all, let's go back to level 1. In Love Me Do, despite alternating between roots and fifths, the fifths never feel like structural changes to the harmony. They always appear on the weaker beats in the middle of the bar. And whatever happens on beat 1 will always be more important in our perception of what the harmony is. So in a case like this, although the bass is playing a note other than the root, we hear it as an elaboration on the harmony and not a change to it. Going back to Michelle, and looking at these bars, we see that on beats 1, there's always a root. On beat 3, there's always some other chord tone, mostly. And on the weak beats, there are always passing tones connecting them, mostly. But these chords, these are inversions. So this doesn't mean that an inversion cannot happen on beat 3. It just means that you have to take into account the context. So it depends on whether it's different from the chord before, how long it lasts, what the rhythmic accents are. You really have to analyze the whole phrase and not just individual chords in a vacuum. So after all this, we can say that level 2 bass lines elaborate upon the harmony by using all of the basic chord tones and by connecting them with the use of passing tones from the scale. And we're still using very simple rhythms, so the result is essentially a walking bass line. So we're almost at the part where you get to talk about guitar, but first we have to go to level 3. And to do that, we need to go back to that last quote that we heard and hear the rest of it. Once I realized that you didn't have to play just the root notes, you might even be able to play notes that aren't in the chord, or maybe even a little tune that goes through the chords that doesn't exist anywhere else. Maybe I can have an independent melody. He's not saying it explicitly, but to me, when he says little tune and independent melody, that implies more rhythmic activity than we've seen so far. And of course, the perfect example of this would be a song like Something. At first glance, it seems complicated, but if we simplify it to its basic structure tones, it actually sounds like a level 1 bass line. So in level 3 then, he is elaborating on the harmony just like he did in level 2, but he's also elaborating the rhythm in a similar way. Just like he plays roots on the downbeats, third, fifths, and sevenths on the beats 3, and on the weakest beats he plays passing tones, with the rhythm, he always lands strongly on beat 1. He doesn't anticipate it or delay it. He is rhythmically active in weaker parts of the bar, and both of these help keep the downbeats very clear. He only anticipates when the voice anticipates and uses very little syncopation. He uses a simple and consistent rhythmic vocabulary, multiples of 16th note subdivisions, not mixing in triplets or other more complicated rhythms, and he crafts his bass line as loose variations on a theme. So this gives us a sense of repetition and also an improvised feel. But how on earth is he getting away with this? Well, this is where the guitar comes in. Many people saw this clip from the Get Back documentary and assumed that this is how Paul always wrote his songs and that bass lines always came first. But this is not true. I would never have played Michelle on bass until I had to record the bass line. Bass isn't an instrument you sit around and sing to. I don't, anyway. Because I was really a guitarist originally, even now I'll just pull my Martin out and I write on a Martin or a piano. And this has implications beyond just the writing process into the recording process. I often used to record without the bass, which George Harrison particularly used to get narked at, but I'd written it on guitar, and I wanted to get the feel of how I'd written it, so I'd often say, "Do you mind if we don't put the bass on? Pretend it's there, and it'll give me a chance to put it on after." So by waiting to put the bass on at the very end, or at least until later, he would have a much clearer picture of what the final arrangement would sound like, allowing him to craft his bass line to suit the song and not the other way around. This is why there aren't that many examples of bass lines as independent and active as this, because the circumstances have to be just right for there to be space for it. Riff-based ones don't really fall into this category. They're a different category to themselves. If the other instruments and voice are also busy, then it just becomes a total mess. The arrangement has to be relatively inactive for there to be space for a bass line like this. And so here it is, a simple guide to bass lines like Paul McCartney. Don't write on bass. So if you really want to write bass lines like Paul McCartney, you better have a solid song and a solid arrangement first. To do that, you need a great chord progression. So you might want to watch this video about how the Beatles chord progressions evolved over time before you do anything else.